Welcome to the Unfettered Speech Podcast. I'm Patrick Sullivan.
And I'm Leonard Goodman.
Leonard, it's good to see you today. You were looking very sharp.
Oh, thank you. Coming from court, so sorry to shock you with a tie, but
Well, I wasn't coming from court. I've been in my home office, and so we're coming from different sartorial perspectives today. But that's fine. We allow many viewpoints. So, and we have a very special guest today.
yes, we do.
Kelley Vlahos, from the editor of Responsible Statecraft, which is published by the Quincy Institute. And let's bring her on. Kelley, welcome.
Oh, thanks for having me, guys.
So, Kelley, we are fans of you, and we're fans of Responsible Statecraft. We use it a lot. You know, we circulate articles amongst ourselves, and many of them come from Responsible Statecraft. We think is a great voice for sanity and peace in the world. And you guys have a very interesting, I think, history and sort of approach to things. So before we get into anything else, maybe you can just give us a very short, thumbnail on what the Quincy Institute is and how Responsible Statecraft, dovetails with Quincy.
Sure. I mean, I came to this almost at the ground level. My boss, Trita Parsi, who I had known for years because as a reporter, I had used him as a source and had been running in similar circles during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. He had come to me and he said, Kelley, you're working at the American Conservative. I was managing an executive editor at the time. And he said, is there room for a transpartisan organization that harnesses both the left and the right against wars, endless wars, for restraint, for diplomacy over militarized foreign policy, like really getting in and re-engineering the failed foreign policy of Washington over the last 40 some odd years? And I said, you bet. I had been working for the American Conservative for several years, but I've also been writing for them since 2007, all through the wars. And yes, it was a magazine. It continues to be a magazine that had been started in part by Patrick Buchanan, who had one of the original America First approaches to foreign policy, saying that, Washington is getting us into all of these wars of choice, beginning with these anti-communism and the Cold War, and then extending to the anti-Islamic jihad wars of the jihad. And, it was coming from a very conservative place that we needed to focus our attention on actual national defense and not going into these adventures that not only spread our troops thin and put them in harm's way, but actually built out an empire that makes us less free, less prosperous, even less safe at home. This isn't new. I mean, this was actually articulated by John Quincy Adams, by George Washington, and many others since then. And so I said, yes, Trita, I said, there is energy. It's just we got to find a way to get these two sides together. And if we do, my goodness, if they can keep us from being so divided, that we have a more powerful voice, one that resonates with regular Americans outside of Washington who are tired of the partisanship. They're tired of the partisan talking points. They're tired of being told that they have to be on a team and wear, a specific team shirt or they don't belong. And he started the Quincy Institute shortly after with actual buy-in from left and right, from the Charles Koch Foundation on the right and George Soros on the left, which made a lot of people either scratch their heads or get very angry. But it actually worked because it conveyed that they were serious. This wasn't just another organization. So, we're nonpartisan, and then end up like raising all their money from left or right. And then once election time comes, put the principles aside and just get into electioneering. It actually works. And I've been with the Quincy Institute for 5 years. And the reason why they brought me in specifically was to run the magazine, which is supposed to be a platform for this transpartisan, principles-based reporting, opinion, an independent marketplace of ideas for foreign policy restraint, which take a look around. I know Len has done a great job in seeding a lot of these media outlets that would have never gotten a break, up to 5 years ago or so. But I mean, the landscape is so barren in terms of the outlets that people can read and learn about foreign policy and national security issues without it being fed from one side or the other, or agenda driven by the war party. Because, you know, it is true that the war party this is a bipartisan enterprise here in Washington where they both buy in, and that's why we call it the Blob. Most of the newspapers and magazines that you read when they're talking about foreign policy are really talking from that sort of liberal, internationalist, blobby perspective that always reaches for the military for that first tool in the toolkit, and really doesn't deviate from the sort of orthodoxies of the last 70 years since World War II. And you say, well, what about the failures in Vietnam and the failures in Iraq? And they say, oh, those are aberrations. We need to keep doing what we're doing, the same thing over and over again. We needed a platform for writers who had been marginalized, who had not gotten a break, had been kept out by the elite media, the gatekeepers, if you will. And I think we've been really successful at it because we've kept to the principles, we've kept the partisanship and party politics out of it. And we've also, given a platform for independent thinking. And guess what? Independent thinkers are better writers. They're more interesting. They're more creative, and they're a real break from the status quo writing that you're reading, wherever it be Washington Post, New York Times, Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs. We're different, and we don't mind being different, but we also are scrappy enough to know that, okay, we're gonna use our elbows, and we're gonna try to get out and get in front of enough people. And it's not just Beltway people, even though we like, Beltway people to read us, but like regular Americans who are just like, they really don't know a lot about foreign policy, but they know that they want to learn more, but they don't want to be manipulated while they're learning these things.
Well, Kelley, you talk about all these failures, but as you guys have, like Vietnam and Iraq and really Afghanistan, Libya, but as you guys have pointed out in your magazine, they're not really failures for the people who are funding these wars because they're incredibly profitable. And
Yeah.
wars that don't solve problems are really the most profitable because they create new problems, and now we need to fund another group, or we need to
Yeah.
send more weapons somewhere else to to we're like the arsonist and the fire brigade, and that's really the most profitable way. And half the times we're fighting people with our own weapons who have our own weapons, and now they're in the wrong hands. So I know this is kind of, I'm not really a question, but you you do you consider yourself a think tank? And I know one of the things that you've been such a great resource for us is sort of explaining the whole think tank world in DC. And maybe you
Mhm.
could tell us a little bit about that. The Atlantic Council and CSIS and all these people that are advising people in the highest places, and they're funded by war profiteers. Um, that's and I'm going to let you answer in a second, but one of the things that I noticed, and you wrote this article that I was just looking at, who's funding DC's pro-war think tanks? Independent experts push contractor agendas. And so one of the examples that you gave was this national defense strategy. Uh, and so we all know that our Congress people are bought off by these war profiteers. But what you point out in this article is that the bipartisan independent commission that is supposed to advise them on whether we need more money for the Pentagon or what's the right budget are also the people that populate that independent commission are also funded by or also come from these think tanks or funded by the war industry. So if you could tell us a little bit about how that game works in
It's so overwhelming. And one of the things that I say when I kind of start off these conversations about the think tank and the military industrial complex world is that most Americans feel like there's something nasty and stinky and wrong about what's going on in Washington. And that's why the whole idea that it's a swamp was really catchy during the first Trump campaign. Like, people know it's a swamp, but what they can't wrap their arms around, and it's hard for most people, is like how and how big it is and why and how everything is interconnected. And people tend to just sort of say, well, yeah, that's the way it is. And I know there's something really wrong going on, but like, it's too big for me to try to reform or get at. And I think a lot of people give up because of some of the things that you laid out. One being that this is a self-licking ice cream cone, and even the failures actually benefit because new enemies are created and new impetus for budgets and for the existence of new combatant commands and troops here and posture there. And it's a never-ending cycle, and it feeds off of itself, and it's really difficult to try and get at that. So what the Quincy Institute did was develop this think tank tracker, as you mentioned, in which anybody can just go online and say, I want to know how much the Atlantic Council is getting from the government and from defense contractors and from foreign governments, two key corruptible areas, and how that might be affecting the output of that particular think tank when they go out and they talk about why we need more weapons to send to Egypt, for example, or we need to continue funding the war in Ukraine, why we need to get involved in new AI technology schemes on the defense side. All of this, you could say, might be traced back to the fact that they're getting money from defense contractors who build AI systems, that they might be getting money from some Gulf state that has an interest in seeing our positioning on a particular weapons deal or security agreement. And it's pretty corrupting. We might not be able to stop that from happening, but when we cast this harsh light on where these think tanks are getting their money, it also casts a harsh light on the network of and the pipeline of money and output, and how members of Congress are voting and how much they're getting from the defense industry. And it allows the American people a sense of agency. And hey, I'm not going to believe what X is saying because I know they're getting money from Saudi Arabia or Raytheon or Northrop Grumman. So I feel like it helps the transparency aspect. As far as your question goes, about what was your question? It was about the
Oh, I
connection.
think you answered. I just wanted you to tell us a little bit about how the think tank game works. We
And
see.
so you mentioned specifically these bipartisan.
Yeah, you had written about
Yes,
the advisors to the National Defense Strategy,
yes,
this bipartisan independent group, and pointed out that even that group that's advising the people who are going to decide how much money goes to the Pentagon,
yeah,
they're all bought and paid for as well. And of course, we see now, and I think one of the things that they said in that report was that this is now it's more dangerous now than it was in 1945. This is the most dangerous existential threat to the United States, and so the war budget needs to be higher, and it always needs to be higher. There's
Yeah,
never any.
we advise that the Pentagon needs more money,
Yeah,
and
newsflash.
Leonard and I were laughing about this earlier, that it's the most dangerous time since 1945. There had just been a nuclear bomb dropped on Japan. It had no economy left. There were millions of people, wandering around with nothing to do. Same in Europe. There was just rubble. There was no security architecture whatsoever. There was the Soviet Union on the eastern flank. And this is like that. It's the most dangerous time since then. Not since the Korean War, not since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, and so
Yeah.
what does it need? More trillions. it's wild and absurd that, this is how things come off. But Kelly, I think one of the things that's, great about that tracker that you mentioned is, the mainstream media, they're not going to report that because they're bought and paid for too. And so they've got a narrative that they've created, and there's no way they're going to point out to anybody that their advisor is also on the board of Raytheon or whatever. They just don't mention it. And the guy comes on MSNBC and says, we need more bombs. And, so, but there's many stories that get put out, by now that are on X or their independent journalism doing through their channels that have hundreds of thousands of views that are more popular than CNN. And so that's a resource for them, which is really amazing that you can, put that out there. I mean, if you looked at the people who are tracking money between NGOs, this is not necessarily on the military side, but NGOs and the government and how all that works is all individuals. They're tracking it themselves because, of course, CBS News is never going to do that.
Oh, yeah.
So that's fantastic. But you have, I think, having spoken to a lot of your colleagues too, you have kind of a special mission where you mentioned the bipartisanship element to it. The two things that make you Quincy a little different is, number one, you really are trying to have this bipartisan approach to things. And number two, you're trying to, I don't know how to put this, but you're trying to remain respectable, meaning, some people who we know well, just say whatever's on their mind. And, they're sort of out there and we love them. But, in the circles of Washington, D.C., they might not carry a lot of weight because they're just,
Yeah.
out. But you're trying to retain that gravitas and the kind of, insider feel, but
Yeah.
yet creating a new way of thinking about things. How hard is that in Washington?
It's fairly difficult because at first nobody wanted to take Quincy seriously. And I know that many of us, I can't speak for everybody who works for Quincy or had been there at the ground level, had toiled away at the margins and had been alienated and ostracized for their point of view at some point in their career. And there was this recognition and Trita had this vision that we want to take our independent and our challenge to the inside. So we want a seat at the table. We want to be able to affect policy on Capitol Hill, in the White House. We no longer want to toil away at the edges and take pot shots from the outside in. And there's nothing wrong with that because a lot of those people are our fellow travelers and allies of Quincy, but we made it a concerted effort. We want to fight the blob from inside the blob. Now, like you said, that creates a little bit of a dilemma in which you have to play the game to a certain extent without losing your principles or your integrity. And I'm so proud because the people I work with have internalized that mission, and I have never seen anybody compromise their ideals or their principles, or the restraint principles that we carry with us inside Washington, just a meeting or just to maintain access. We are in this to push an agenda of peace, of ending endless wars, of challenging the military industrial complex and the status quo and all of the corruption that comes with it, and a dedication to our nation's veterans so that we do not keep sending them into wars of choice, into wars that Washington can't seem to explain in an elevator pitch. If we maintain that, whether it's a Republican in office or a Democrat in office, Biden or Trump, and not see our role as just preparing and attempting to get some sort of greater access to the levers of power, which most of the people in Washington, that's what they do for a living. It creates an environment, like I believe Quincy is, of people who are just full of integrity, full of energy, and ideals and values. And I think that feeds off and it sets a tone. So you come here to work at Quincy and you see that like this isn't your normal business as usual in Washington. And you in turn internalize that. And I feel like I did the same thing for Responsible Statecraft. Early on it was hard. People would send me pieces and they would have an ideological, more about political bias. There was a lot of acrimony over Donald Trump's 2020 loss and January 6th. And then there was a lot of overhang from his first administration and then the incoming Biden administration. Like the goals was to really get out of Afghanistan. And then there was some, like how tough should we be on Biden? And I feel like Responsible Statecraft and Quincy were like, no, we need to get out of Afghanistan, and we're going to tell the president what we're saying all along. And then we threaded, a lot of the polarization and the angst that was going on in Washington at the time. And I'm pretty proud because I feel like we put out like these stories that are just, they are, like I said, independent analysis, outside of like the manipulation of the elite media. And I love the fact that there are other platforms now that did not exist before that are able to amplify, and we amplify each other's work. And just a note about, social media. I mean, the think tank tracker is an amazing tool, but it takes what I feel is though it's taken on a life of its own, so that critics of the military industrial complex and of think tanks and the corruption in Washington are able to take the stuff that they get off of that think tank tracker and a lot of the good research that our team is doing, and they amplify it on social media and they say, we're not going to get fooled. I see this all the time. We had a story up, not super relative to our conversation, but we had a story up about an Israeli influence campaign in which influencers are being paid upwards of $7,000 per post in this campaign, and that's taken off like wildfire.
I see it all over social media now.
Because other
7,000 figures. You unearthed that?
Yes, that was Nick Cleveland Stout, our one of our staffers, who wrote the piece for Responsible Statecraft. And it was because it's been amplified by social media, and people are like, we're not getting fooled. So anytime there's an obvious influencer who's out there trying to, spoon feed their talking points, somebody will go 7,000. Or, on the think tank side, people are like, hey, we're not going to buy everything this think tank is saying, because we hear that you get so much money from the Pentagon, so much money from Saudi Arabia. You get so much money from, the federal government, USAID, maybe not anymore. And so I feel like it's taken on a bit of a life of its own. Whereas in the past, and you only had New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, and they're like so gatekeeping everything that even a spectacular story like the $7,000 influencer post probably would have gone nowhere without the independent media that you guys are seeding and helping to flourish, but as well as social media, which is like real-time reaction and really amplifying the truth.
I have a 10-year-old daughter, and she has all these influencers, and they're telling her, she's telling me that she needs to buy this and she needs to buy that, and I'm telling, and she thinks they're her friends, but I'm trying to teach her, like, well, find out who's paying them,
Right.
But I want to push back a little bit, because you said we can't stop this from happening. That's sort of the way Washington works, this pay to play system. And I've never really accepted that, because, we do have there are conflict of interest laws that have been passed, not in the federal government. The federal government won't touch them, but in state, Illinois has one. I mean, Illinois has its own problems for sure, but it is illegal. And a lot of these laws were passed in partisan ways to go after one particular character, but it's still, they're constitutional. So you can pass a law that says we have a right, citizens have a right to conflict-free decision makers. So if the governor is deciding whether to put concrete or asphalt on the roads, he can't take money from the concrete, campaign funds from the concrete people and then decide he's going to use those contractors. And those laws are constitutional. No one really disputes that. We do have a, so the federal government could do that. And I know
Yeah.
it's been proposed, but it's never gone to even, it's never even made it to the floor for a hearing. So I'm just wondering whether that's something, um, rather than just saying, that's the way Washington works and we can't take the money out of politics. I understand Citizens United and all that, but conflict of interest is a different matter. We do have a right to representatives who are not bought and paid for when they're making. Now they can be bought and paid for by other interests, but when they're deciding what the defense budget is, they can't take money from General Dynamics and Lockheed Martin, and then
It's so
decide that. Yeah,
frustrating
yeah.
because they do, and these
I
companies,
understand,
they
but
even,
I'm just saying, have you thought about pushing some sort of conflict of interest? Because there are models out there.
yeah, there are definitely models, and maybe that not that specific rule, but I know that a lot of the people that we've worked with, both on the Hill and off, have been trying very hard, for example, to reform the lobbying laws, the grace periods you have. Like when you leave office, you can't immediately go and work for a firm and start lobbying on behalf of a company in front of your old colleagues at the Pentagon, for example. Those rules are really loose right now, and there's lots of effort to make them tighter, but you have to have the enforcement as well. And so, like, I know that there are active, particularly, I know that uh, Senator Warren has worked very hard on these issues, but it unfortunately, it's an uphill battle. So you have the revolving door issues, which I feel like that is one of the biggest problems we have is members or high Pentagon officials leaving office and then going right into a defense contractor, and having all those contacts in the e-ring, and then being able to say, "Oh, I'm going to meet with my contacts in the e-ring and tell him how great your gun or your missile system, your fighter jet is," and they have that old buddy network that's just humming along. And a lot of these members, a lot of these officers have already had the contacts with the companies before they even leave their jobs at the Pentagon. And there are rules against that too that don't always get enforced. So you have these guys who are already advocating for a company because they know they're going to face like a $500,000 a year salary when they get out, plus stock options. So the corruption's already started, and then afterwards it's, they're in the opposite role where they are the lobbyist. And this happens all throughout the federal government, whether it's in the Pentagon to the contractor pipeline, or like the Google to the administrative state pipeline, where they're working in the DOJ, and they're making regulations for their old pals back at Google. I mean, it's really corrupt. And so I share your instincts for trying to do something about it. I know that they've tried to cut off members of Congress owning stocks in defense, or owning stocks at all in any realm for which they will be making policy. But the defense realm is like, that is the worst. So you have members who are holding defense stocks and even trading them and buying them like days before a war breaks out. And policies are suddenly in front of their committee where they are agreeing to send more weapons to said country, or allow some other movement that would bind us to the country in question to further their war aims. We have allies all over the world that we have security arrangements with, and oh my goodness, so
But
these
Nancy
members
Pelosi
holding
says that's
stock, I
fine.
mean, it just doesn't make sense to me.
Nancy Pelosi says that's fine. I think that's the last word on the subject. What more is there to say? But that kind of thing, it used to be like Nancy Pelosi could say it's fine, and then the news would say like, okay, well, we asked and it's fine. So,
Yeah,
but now, what happens when she says that? Some smart aleck goes and creates a fund of everything that Nancy Pelosi's family
that's
bought,
right.
and they have a tracker. It's like, hey, you want to get rich like Nancy Pelosi? And it's out every day. People see it and laugh. And the narrative is shattering. And so, yes, on the one hand, we live in a highly transactional political system where, as you said, the Pentagon, there's this revolving door at the Pentagon. It's true in the agricultural department. It's true in the Treasury. It's true in every single department. And I've met people who do this. They're in power for a while and they don't make a lot of money, and then they're out of power and they make a lot of money, and then they go back into power and take a pay cut, and then they go out and they make 10 times more than they made so they just keep that going. But the thing that maybe you can do that to confront that is what you're doing, which is the sort of ideas, and saying that, take wars, for example. The arguments for wars often were democracy or protecting babies or, poor refugees or something that are out there, or freedom. And so those were very powerful things, and they were simple to say. And so you'd say, well, we have to kill, 50 million people in Iraq, or no, sorry, it's more like four, I guess, 4 million people in Iraq because of freedom. Um, and and nobody had a good answer to that. But you mentioned some words that that kind of struck me when you said the swamp, which I think is a Trump word, but it's very simple. It's very understandable. Forever wars. I don't know who coined forever wars, but again,
Orwell.
was it Orwell? Well, it got popular in the last few years, where you can say, no, I'm not for forever. I believe in freedom, but I'm not for forever wars. And people go, oh, okay, well, there's an argument. Um, I think part of what you're doing is creating this kind of intellectual space where
Yes.
people have an easy way to frame the anti-war argument. And of course, it's not as powerful as money. But on the side now, when you look at Ukraine, you see these analogies of it's schoolyard analogies. Well, you've got to stand up to bullies. You've got to punch bullies in the nose. And it's like, we're talking about nuclear war here. We're not talking about a playground of nursery school people. Scott Horton, like, funnily pointed out that the people who are saying that are the ones who actually got beat up by bullies when they were when they were in elementary school. They weren't punching anybody in the nose, but now they get to do that. But at any rate, the idea that these ideas can have their power, and it's not perfect against money, obviously, but how long can there be Nancy Pelosi's when there's a Nancy Pelosi tracker?
Right. I think what you're describing, and I feel like, having been friends with Scott for a very long time and having talked with him through the Iraq War, when we were like this tiny minority and these tiny voices like speaking out into the wind, it seemed. It is refreshing to see so many other voices there permeating the space, and I think that has caused some very lazy thinkers and writers to have to stand up and explain themselves. And they don't really know how to, because for all of these years, we've listened to the liberal internationalist Blob, plus the neocons and the Cold War warriors tell us, well, don't worry, the adults in the room, we're handling it. It's about freedom. It's about security. It's about protecting our allies, and all of the common tropes that we hear. And for so long, as you say, that was enough. And there were a lot of pathologies going on. A lot of people during the 90s, for example, or like the 80s rather, really felt like the American people let the Vietnam veterans down. And so all you needed to say is, you need to support this war because you can't let the troops down. If you don't support this war, you don't support your troops. And that sounds pretty ridiculous today, but I remember in 1989 and 1990, right before the Gulf War, these kinds of things were common in terms of trying to persuade and manipulate the American people into supporting the war on behalf of of Kuwait against Iraq and Saddam Hussein. And so, like, they were able to get away with a lot. And after 9/11, same thing. This was all about not just the revenge for 9/11, but then it became, like you said, this fight for freedom, the
Freedom, they
liberation,
hate our democracy. The other one that
spreading democracy.
people still use on me sometimes is well, this is Hitler, this is the next Hitler,
Mhm.
and you, as a peace advocate, are Neville Chamberlain. And so everything is Hitler and Neville Chamberlain. And it's like, not everything is
But
Hitler.
people aren't buying it anymore. And
No,
that's the
people
good
aren't
thing.
buying it. People are not buying it. But,
And one of the reasons why is because they really effed up in Iraq, and they lied to the American people about WMDs. The American people would have supported Afghanistan and going after the Al Qaeda that caused 9/11, but lying to us about the WMDs ripped the mask off. And you can't just put that whatever toothpaste back in the bottle. And so, like, that became a decades long decline in American trust about anything, whether it be the military or Washington or Congress, their churches. Like, add in the Catholic scandal, it was a decade of just the veil being ripped. And I feel like the American people after that were primed to be suspicious of anything that the American government or their institutional leaders writ large were saying. And so that opened the space for Donald Trump to come in, the outsider, and basically say, you're right about all these clowns here, and I'm going to fix things. Well, one of the things he did was say that the Iraq war was a failure, that we were lied to. I will never do that to you. We can't be the world's policeman. We're getting out of forever wars. And that gave people on the right a real impetus and permission to really start questioning all of those tropes that they had been sold on, particularly on the right, about like the troops, about appeasement, about not being tough on terror, and I give him a lot of credit for the sea change that we've seen in terms of people's thinking about war and about interventions abroad, about alliances. There's so much to talk about here, because then you got Russiagate, and that eroded a lot of people's feelings about whether or not we should be defending Ukraine and doing everything we're being told we need to do in that war. We could go on for hours, but I just feel like there's just so much more independent thinking and questioning that this blob never had to do before. They never had to explain themselves.
Mhm. Yeah. Can I like to switch topics a little bit to another thing that you've written about, and that is security clearances and sort of government secrecy. You wrote one article where I think you were talking about Trump revoking security clearances of people like Brennan and some of these people. And it was one thing that was shocking to me that I learned from your article. First of all, there's some 3 million people that have security clearances,
Yeah.
and that people actually retain their security clearances. Because I actually had a security clearance. I had one national security case where I represented a Guantánamo detainee, and it was made clear to me that my security clearance would expire as soon as the case was over. And my client was sent back to Kandahar, Afghanistan, finally after 12 years without charge at Guantanamo Bay. And at that point, I had no security clearance. But apparently, some of these people keep their security clearances forever and monetize them and make a lot of money with them. So that was something that was very interesting. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that. And also, if you could just explain, my feeling of security clearance is basically what they want you to do is sign a piece of paper saying, it doesn't say this, but the unwritten contract is that if I see government crimes, I'll keep my mouth shut. And that's what I'm agreeing. And if I don't, I could be prosecuted under the Espionage Act or something. And we've seen that happen under Obama. I think he had more Espionage Act prosecutions than any other president. So if you could comment on those two things, sort of the way the way the security game is played in DC and the excessive secrecy.
Yeah, I mean, wow. I mean, I would compare like this to like sort of medieval palace uh, culture, in which if you had a certain knighthood or you had a certain status, it would open up all the doors to the kingdom, and you would be there in the palace, in the thrall of the elite circle. And I compare that to this security clearance that is bestowed upon you, and it opens up everything in Washington to you. Now, am I overstating this? Am I being a little dramatic? Maybe. But I think the worst thing that Trump could have done to his political enemies was take away their clearance. Why? Because it's not only a requirement for many jobs within the military industrial complex, it is also a signifier of your status within that Washington elite world. And so you may not even be doing anything within any security environment, but just the fact that you can put that on your CV, or tell somebody you have one in an interview, or in casual conversation, it puts you up into another echelon of stat. Everything is about status in Washington, D.C. In New York, status is huge, but it's money that talks. In DC, it's power and it's status, and that security clearance buys you that. Now you could say, "Well, I work for the USDA. What do I care?" Okay, fine. I'm just going to talk about the national security world and the world of war and peace. And so when Trump did that, it was like taking a limb off of somebody, because that means that they do not have the bragging rights. They don't have the key. So a lot of times, serving on a commission or serving on a board, or being part of some quasi-governmental program like the Defense Science Board, they want to know you have a clearance. And so he did some damage there. As far as secrecy and the proliferation after 9/11, I mean, I think I coined 3 million security clearance holders. Most of that was proliferated after 9/11 and the explosion of the national security state, when you had all of these people working in data sifting and surveillance centers that were all sprouting up in Northern Virginia and Maryland. I mean, millions and millions, and if not billions of dollars had gone into building out like this infrastructure of spying on Americans, really. Spying, data sifting, surveillance, the whole thing. And in order to do that, you had to give people clearances. And as you say, a lot of them maintain those clearances, whether they were still working in that data center or for this contractor consulting firm or not. And that's how it works. You're really supposed to renew them. It's not something that just hangs with you. It's like a passport. You do have to get it renewed. But like some of these, from what I understand, can extend years down the road. And of course, they have different gradations. They have like the real special ones that get you into special rooms in the Pentagon. But like your basic ones will help you get jobs and open doors for you in certain circles in Washington. And as far as this these secretive, or the secrecy aspect, as you know, they overclassify everything. And so, as much as you have a lot of people with security clearances, it still walls off this whole world
What
from
I
the rest
noticed,
of America.
if I could just say, what I noticed with respect to the Guantanamo case, so nothing in my client's file had any national security concerns. He was a farmer, you know from the rural area outside of Kandahar, and he was sold to the Americans for a bounty. But what they did is they classified every shred of paper in the file, so that to defend him, I had to get on a plane to look at any of the evidence. I would have to get on a plane and go to a skiff to look through it, and nothing in there should have been classified. But it also allowed the government to lie, because if you remember, Cheney was saying at this time, these are the worst of the
Yep.
worst, and it was all a big lie. And they knew, most of those people there were marginally connected to any sort of group, if at all. And and the other thing that they do is like you say, the gradation. So they would give the defense lawyer sort of the lowest level of clearance, and then like when the case against my client fell apart, the government said, "Oh, we found some new document that's really incriminating, but you can't see it because it's above your security clearance level. But we'll give you a summary of it." And I'm like,
Oh,
"Don't try to defend my client like that." So anyway, yeah, it's a big racket, and I've already got a little window into it, but you've certainly done a lot of work on it.
well, I have to say, and I'd really like to thank you for all the work that you did on behalf of your client there. I had done a bunch of stories at the time because I was very lucky to have met two Army reservist JAGs who were actually defending Guantanamo detainees. And so I had a lot of insight into what they had to go through with their clients. And I believe it really takes special people to put yourself out there, defend these people who, like you said, 99% of them turned out to be innocent or marginally connected to these crimes. And I think they've only really convicted, a handful out of all of the hundreds of people
I
who
think they had
spent years
700
there.
there originally, and then they quietly like released most of them, and now I think there's like maybe 50 people still there.
Well, thank you for doing that because I mean it's
Well, it's
purely selfless
fascinating
work.
to learn about this sort of the secrecy. So I appreciate your work on it as well.
Yeah, having said that, 3 million people, that's almost 1% of the country. So, you're in a group with 100 people, and one, statistically is likely to have a security clearance, go to a football game, and there's thousands of these people. That's amazing that there's so many. I mean, again, great work that you're doing to
Yeah, this is a weird town. I mean,
yeah.
this is a weird, the DMV, what they call it, is it's a strange place. I mean, I'm not saying that I dislike it. I'm very much interested in trying to do my part in exposing it, but like it got really weird after 9/11. And I am not exaggerating the amount of money that was flowing into where I live in Arlington, Virginia, and the Maryland suburbs. I mean, talk about a military industrial complex built upon an existing one. You had it was, the Department of Homeland Security is like the perfect example where you created an entire bureaucracy after 9/11 that's now a world of its own. It was only supposed to be this umbrella organization that oversaw like 22 existing agencies so that they would coordinate better. But now you have this huge bureaucracy that's in everybody's business. It's another national security state on its own because it deals with the homeland. And you're never going to get rid of it because you have thousands and thousands of people in this area whose livelihoods depend on this bureaucracy sustaining itself. But the bureaucracy is all built on spying on people, going to war, creating new weapons to, keep control over the American people and violate their civil liberties.
Can I ask one more thing on this topic because it's not that often we talk to somebody that's actually inside the swamp, sort of, but we used to hear, or at least I've read that like RFK when he was the Attorney General, that you could walk into his office and talk to him. Um, Now to get into the DOJ building, I only know this because my work on that one case, but it's like you have to go through layers and
Yeah,
layers of security and puffer machines and all this stuff. And it's like there's something weird about that our government is so afraid of us, the
yeah.
people who they're supposed to be working for. They're so afraid of us, and it seems that there's something sick about that. I was wondering
It's
if you could
very
talk a
sick.
little bit about your experience, just the security. I mean, now you need security to go to a wedding practically. You have to go
Yeah,
through.
I think they already hated us, the American people, but there were norms in place. There was this hewing to this idea that this was the people's house, the people's capital. And so there was at the time, obviously a less stringent security atmosphere before 9/11. So I moved here before 9/11 in 1999. So I had some taste of what it was like at the tail end of the Clinton administration, just before that crazy election between Gore and Bush. And as a reporter, and I was credentialed, I'd walk right into the Capitol. Of course, I had to like show my credential, but once I was in there, I could just walk around anywhere. And I would, I love it. It's the most beautiful building architecturally. After 9/11, nothing. I mean, even the museums, you walk in, and I had a baby at the time, at 2000, let's just say 3, after my son was born, and they separated me from his stroller to put him through a different magnetometer. And I was really pissed. And I'm like, what town am I living in? But none of that has gone away. I feel like this just gave them permission to put all of these controls, these authoritarian measures. I think, as you know, a lot of people, I see people two ways. You have your authoritarians and you have your anti-authoritarians. A lot of your authoritarians go like work for the government, and they love, creating rules and controls. And 9/11 gave them the impetus to do that, and they're never going back. So as you said, it actually seems to be getting worse, where I have to get an escort just to get into the building now. Now, I'm not a credentialed, I don't have press credentials anymore, so I don't know how different it is, but they built the whole visitor center. And so like so if I was to go on official business, I'd have to have an escort from whatever office I'm visiting, come outside, bring me in. Everybody else has to go through the visitor center. It doesn't feel like the people's house anymore. I also believe, like, you saw a lot of this during COVID. All of a sudden, there's all these controls over our behavior, but the justification was we want to keep everybody safe and we don't want elderly and children to get sick, yada, yada. But a lot of those things never went away. So there are a lot of controls that still exist because of COVID, but yet COVID is supposedly not a threat anymore. I just think, there are a lot of people who just love to make rules and control.
I want to let Pat.
Here is where you see it the most.
I want to let Pat in, but I'm thinking about the January 6th, the videos of those people, and they were so happy to just be in the Capitol and looking around, So
They're gawking. I have a funny story. I actually went down to, not to the Capitol, but to the White House to listen. I caught the tail end of Trump's speech, or I missed it, and I saw people coming back from the speech. So this is before they walked to the Capitol. And I was going, wow, this is a pretty tame crowd. Everybody's families and children, elderly, guys on, walkers. And then I get back to the office, and the time that it took me to walk from the White House to get into the office, my television was on and Fox News was on. And I saw people walking in the Capitol, and they're gawking and they're pointing at paintings and statues. And I go, when did they open the Capitol for tours again?
That's funny.
Because COVID got rid of all the tours, because God forbid you walk in the Capitol and give someone COVID. And it turned out they were the rioters that had gotten in, and they, like you said, they got in and they were like, ooh.
So, well, one more question, but then we should wrap up. But so one thing that you mentioned, Leonard, like sick society that has all these controls and things in place, and Kelley, you said it too, that they hate us. And they just were putting up with it. They were able to hide their contempt before, and now it's harder for them to hide it. If you step a little bit away from the Washington area, go over to Europe and the UK, you see what's happening there. Two things happening at once. All these draconian speech measures playing out, whether it's online safety acts or child, whatever they call it in different jurisdictions. Digital ID in the UK now, that even though thousands of people, millions of people have signed a petition against it, are saying, no, we're still going to we're going with the digital ID. And militarization, talk about reconstituting drafts, things like that. What's going on over there, and why do you think that's happening?
I don't know. I can't. I do feel that as we become more connected by communications like social media, the internet, I do feel like we become more universal in our behavior. And maybe they're just taking a page from the playbook in the United States. I mean, we talk, our politicians talk a big game about the success of our security apparatus. And let's be frank, this is a big business. I mean, I just did an interview about Larry Ellison, and apparently he has an $8 billion contract with the government in the UK to help them, roll out this national ID program that's very controversial over there. And so you have Palantir, you have Anduril, you have Oracle, you have all of these defense tech, defense, homeland, whatever, law enforcement type companies who have tools that they want to sell the government and convince the government they need them. So it's a big business, just like war is. The Patriot Act unleashed a lot of technology trained on American citizens. That is another example. You're never going to claw back the Patriot Act and all of the tools that were given to the FBI and other agencies to spy on Americans and to erode our civil liberties. So when I hear people talk about, like, let's get a new authorization for military force and take away the old ones, and we'll sunset it. We'll put sunset conditions in it. So it has to sunset after when Congress leaves, and they'll have to renew it. Like, they will renew it, because that's what they did with the Patriot Act. There are a number of measures within the Patriot Act. And every year or whenever it comes up from renewal, they hem and they haw and they wring their hands and they end up renewing it.
Ultimately, it's about freedom. We can't release the Patriot Act. It's about freedom and the troops or something. So that's getting back to your sort of the ideas that you're generating. So thank you, Kelley, for everything you're doing. And Quincy Institute is an amazing organization. We're really, glad to know you guys. And you deserve more recognition probably than you have. But yeah, I think you're really making a difference.
Oh, thank you so much. You too.
Great. Well, we'd love to have you back. I mean, we said if we had time, we'd talk about current events, and we didn't really have time. So maybe someday we'll get you back and talk about what's happening, because every day there's something new that's, it gets worse every day, but there's always something to talk about.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Kelley. Yeah, like and subscribe. We have to remember to say that.
Yes.
Yeah.